Hello and welcome to the newest episode of Before They Knew Better, the podcast from DIY Magazine. My name is Lisa Wright and here is my co-host and producer. His name is Giles Bidder.
Hi Lisa.
It is the last episode of season 2 of Before They Knew Better and we are rounding it out with a goodie. Today we are joined by the one and only Carrie Brownstein, Sleater-Kinney legend, Portlandia legend, written a really bloody great memoir, has just been sort of like doing brilliant artistic things in many different mediums for decades now. Sleater-Kinney released their most recent album Little Rope earlier this year. They will also be in the UK for a bunch of festivals. They'll be at All Points East, they're at End of the Road. They're also doing a few of their own headline shows, which I believe are mostly sold out. Brudenell's sold out. Oh no, Glasgow, you can go and see him in Glasgow still. But before then, you can carry on listening to the object, the song, and the photo from her teenage years that Carrie has brought in. It is what we ask all people to bring in, and Carrie's were great. Carrie obviously sort of grew up in a really just like seminal period of American grunge culture. She was in Seattle, she was in Washington, and she spoke about going to see Nirvana back in the early days, about going to school with Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill and that whole scene. It just sounded like basically the coolest time that you could grow up in. But she also had a lot of distinctly nerdy, cute bits before she found her full musical self. So it was I would say like a pretty inspiring chat from Carrie. She's obviously such an articulate person, but almost everything that she had to say, I feel, could be put on some sort of like quotes to give young women book that would help them find their best self. So, you know, if you've got a kid out there, tell them to listen to Carrie on the podcast. She's got some great advice. So without further ado, let us hand over to the last episode of this season with Before They Knew Better, the podcast from DIY Magazine, and with Sleater-Kinney's Carrie Brownstein. Are you quite a bougie tourer these days, Carrie? Like, I feel like sort of taking around your own coffee devices is like an adult grown-up way of touring.
I think it's just because we have a bus, which is, you know, something we didn't always have in Sleater-Kinney, but I guess for the last decade or so, we've graduated to the bus, and then you get to have some creature comfort. So I suppose it's adult, but I think that those of us who are touring on a bus, we tend to bring certain things from home that help establish some kind of routine and consistency. And coffee now in America and almost anywhere in Europe, I mean, globally, you can get a great coffee anywhere. But I think I sort of need the coffee before the coffee. So I get up on the bus, make a little coffee, and then wander out to find coffee.
Which I'd imagine is quite, I mean, obviously this is a podcast about youth, about, you know, your teenage years and growing up and all that. And I would imagine that maybe the first tours that you were doing with the band were not ones where you would have these sort of hope. Can you remember like the first proper Sleater-Kinney tour and like piling into a car or however you were getting around?
Yeah, I didn't actually drink coffee until my late 20s. I think everyone drinks coffee now, including teenagers. But I think like in the 80s and 90s, like coffee was for your parents, you know, it was for people with like a desk job. You know, people would go off to work or just a job in general, right? You know, they needed coffee before they hit the office or the factory or wherever they were going. But kids didn't drink coffee. But now, you know, we just live in this highly overstimulated society where we've sort of been taught that we need to be at this like high functioning level from the second we get up. So I did not drink any coffee, even in my university years or the early years of Sleater-Kinney. And certainly I would not have been making it in any way that resembled how I make it now. We were touring in a very derelict van for many years. I mean, up until The Woods probably. So for the first, you know, at least decade or so of the band, we were just in in a van with driving ourselves from gig to gig. And not in Europe, of course, we would have someone drive us. But even then, it was just one crew member, loading our own gear onto the stage and setting up ourselves and then playing. And I'm glad we did that, because in some ways we can still do that if called upon. We know how everything works. We know the ins and outs of both the business side of tour, the logistics, and all that. So I don't begrudge any of that, sort of scrappier version of the band. I think it's good for building a character and grit, I think.
Yeah, was there also, not to make this entirely a conversation about coffee, but I read something the other day where somebody was like, when you're young, you think that alcohol is the adult drink. And then when you're a teenager, you think that coffee is the adult drink. And when you're an adult, you just realize that water is the adult drink. Just like water is the key. Water's the key, guys. Drink loads of water, stay hydrated. But yeah, I mean, did you sort of romanticize? Because I think, like, when I think about kind of, especially in the sort of like Seattle scene that you were in and that whole sort of time, the idea of like everyone kind of piling into this tiny little squashed up thing and loading in yourself and it all being super DIY feels like such a sort of, like a romantic idea of what being in a band would be. Like, do you feel like you kind of bought into that whole thing, or were you like, I cannot wait until we can get a bus and a crew?
Oh, I never assumed we would get a bus or a crew. I think we were just taking it one album at a time. I think it's easy looking back to romanticize it, but I think at the time I wasn't romanticizing it. I felt very lucky to be able to tour. It felt like a really wonderful, unique way to spend a summer or a spring. I was still going to university, so I would, we would only tour kind of in the summer. So that felt pretty novel. But road trips, it just felt like a version of a road trip, except with a lot of guitars. But I think what I enjoyed was just getting to see the country or the world. I had never traveled to Europe as a kid with my family. So it was, for me, it was the first time taking an international flight, going to, the UK or mainland Europe or Australia or Japan. I mean, these were all through the lens of the band. And that felt very fortunate. But it was not easy it was more of a grind, I would say, in terms of the packing into a small van. But we just didn't know any other version of it. That's just what you did, unless you were pretty established or big at that point.
But learn how to sort of Tetris yourselves and all of your things into a very small space, which I think is like a skill that people seem to get really good at. The kind of the Jengaing of stuff into a very small. You would be really good at moving house now, I imagine. Or small cupboards. Yeah,
Corin and I basically think of being in a band as being glorified movers. I mean, there's just so much of being in a band, no matter, I assume there are bands that never touch their own gear, but I feel like there are still times where what I'm doing is moving an amplifier from a basement or a room in my house into a van that then now someone else takes to the airport to be shipped or gets, they're at a certain point, someone else is taking the equipment from me, but there's still very much a hands-on aspect that just feels like moving and lifting and, just basically a logistics company. But yes, we would call it, you're very right in, likening it to Tetris. We called it the pack, like who was the best at the pack. And there were some of us who were better than others in terms of spatial relationships, figuring out the most effective way to get everything into a small space.
Glamorous rock and roll.
So glamorous.
It's essentially maths and weightlifting in a job with a gig at the end. But I mean, like, even at that, so I'm sure that I did know this at some point, but it sort of reinvigorated that knowledge that like actually at your, as well as obviously meeting bandmates at your school, you were also at school with like Kathleen Hanna and loads of other sort of musicians from that time, which when you look back is bonkers that like, you know, that's sort of just two seminal bands from a scene that would literally grow up together. Like, can you remember like meeting those guys for the first time? Did you all hang out as like just a little crew before you were in bands and stuff together?
Well, they were already in bands, so I'm a couple of years younger than those guys. So I was still in high school when a fan of Bikini Kill or Corin's first band, Heavens to Betsy. So when I moved to Olympia, I moved knowing that I would attend college, but that I would also hopefully be able to immerse myself into this very fertile music scene. And it was sort of a reconnaissance mission right when I got there, just trying to sort of move around and go to every show and I could and meet all the other musicians. And most people were already in bands. It felt difficult to find someone who wasn't in one, let alone three bands. Yeah. And eventually I did. But yeah, it was definitely a scene. You know, it was a music and arts community, and we all hung out to a certain extent. And then within that, there were people who were friends and truly hung out more. And then those of us who just sort of hung out in the context of a show or some kind of music event. But it was close knit, and there was a lot of conversation and discourse between bands and between band members. And I think that's where you get those really incendiary scenes, is when it's people who see someone else play and are inspired by their guitar playing or inspired by their songwriting. And then you try to do a better version of that. It's sort of a competitive, but also, there's something that's communal about it as well. But you sort of need a feeling that is tactile and a feeling that is, kind of a immersive sensory environment. And I think scenes are important in that way, because it's artists in conversation with other artists, and therefore you're thinking and reconsidering what you're doing in order to actually find a place in that world and to be respected. And there was a lot of amazing things going on. There was a handful of labels: K Records, Kill Rock Stars, Chainsaw, and a handful of basement recording studios. So you could really, in this very insular, relatively small town, form a band, play shows, record an album, and have a label there that would put out your albums and then go on tour. So we were very lucky. And there were a handful of those scenes, of course, across the US that sort of blew up at the time. And there were corollaries to those scenes in the UK, of course. There's a place like Glasgow. There were a ton of bands up there at the time. Obviously bands in London or up in Newcastle. There were all these kind of analogs to what we were doing. And you sort of form this international, I don't know, club, I guess, where you're sort of it was very fun.
Yeah, I think like an important bit, because I always think like you sort of like the way that those scenes kind of really work. Like there was, a bunch of bands in South London recently, and I feel like that was the most exciting, loads of stuff that we've written about in DIY was all of these bands, and they'd all play together, and it'd be very sort of like, it would, there's an element of competition, but like more than that, it's kind of people taking each other on tour, people giving each other a leg up in interviews, someone talking about 5 other bands that they're mates with, that, if you like us, then you'll like them. That sort of like real camaraderie, which I think is quite central to any scene feeling like real, rather than some sort of, puppet mastered industry thing trying to connect bands together. Like, was that the vibe where it felt very kind of like everyone was trying to kind of be part of or to help each other out, rather than kind of there's only room for one of us?
Yeah, when I use the word competition, I mean it in sort of a sense of I guess, an artistic sense where you are driven to be as good as someone else because you are inspired, not because you want to keep them down or surpass them, but that you just, you want to be as good as all of your favorites and everyone who's inspiring you. So no, it was certainly more built on community and camaraderie. And because so many things were word of mouth, it was pre-internet. So there wasn't a system in place except for actual people in order to make connections. You couldn't just go online and get a phone number, email someone. It was literally someone handing you a piece of paper or notebook. Here are people who are booking shows in the US and not at big clubs necessarily. A lot of people didn't want to play 21 and over clubs in the US. So it was like, okay, here are the kids across the US putting on all ages shows, in like veterans halls or, mixed use spaces or basements or, putting on shows at their college. You had to actually have a piece of paper in hand, a name, a phone number, and you relied upon other people to have gone out on those tours and come back and said, okay, if you want to play this small town in North Dakota, there's this one guy, and just tell him us. So it was very much a passing on of information, a lot of sharing. And yeah, I mean, it was the only way to do it at that point. So there was, I think, a lot of generosity, a lot of taking other bands out on tour. And then that's how you met people in other cities, so someone would have, like the Pastels, also a couple of years older than us, from Glasgow. They had been playing with bands like Beat Happening or the Go Team, which was Toby Vale's band with Calvin Johnson. They had already gone over there and met these bands in Glasgow. And then our generation, it was, the Yummy Fur were playing, Alex Capranos was playing in Yummy Fur. He went on to be in Franz Ferdinand. There was just there was a band called Biss that were around for, everyone just kind of formed these communities based on friendships and based on, epistolary relationships, being pen pals, keeping in touch. And obviously it got a lot easier, but I think that effort really fomented, just a dedication. It's because it really required some effort and some, I don't know, just, you kind of had to put a little more work in, and I'm not putting extra value on that. That was just what you had to do. So I think there were some real connections made at that time, because there wasn't anything flimsy about it. It wasn't ephemeral, like, oh, I can take it or leave it. I'm not going to answer this email, or, I'm going to ignore this text message. It was like, I am writing a letter to this person. And that's a different way of being in the world. And I think a lot of very foundational friendships were made, and a lot of wonderful collaboration between, artists and scenes existed at that time. And I think that's why people romanticize, people who weren't around then kind of look back and think, oh, that must have been amazing. It's what it was. I would have taken, yes, we started to, obviously, I guess I had technically had email, but it was like a very early iteration of email, that was through your university, but I would have taken all those conveniences now. I was glad when they arrived. I was happy to have a cell phone and not have to use a payphone on tour.
Did you learn that kind of hard work etiquette when you moved to Olympia? Or do you think, did you have that as a teenager, where if you liked something, you really liked it?
Etiquette's an interesting word. I think it just literally was how that was the mode of discovery. The mode of discovery involved the tactile, involved the literal, moving or, traversing from one place to another, putting it in your hands, asking someone, you were really at the mercy of the record store employee. You would go into a record store. You didn't really, you could read music magazines or fanzines and get a sense, but some of those were very mainstream. There were a couple interesting, like, smaller publications. And obviously, like, things like NME and Melody Maker were much more interesting than a lot of the mainstream US music magazines at the time. But we had things like Option and Puncture and a couple of smaller magazines, and a lot of fanzines. So you would sort of go in with this idea of, okay, I'm looking for these 7 inches or these albums. And, often, now we would just call them sort of gatekeepers, and they kind of were at the time. Like if they had good taste in music, then you were lucky. If they felt like they wanted to keep the information to yourself, you'd kind of be screwed, and you'd just wander through the record store. But yeah, that I think it just took, that's how you gleaned information. It was just a different kind of searching, it more legwork, more kind of boots on the ground, more word of mouth. And so that's just what we did. I mean, now, of course, I don't mind that it's really easy to find something, but I am glad I had the other version of it too. And you attach so much meaning, I think, to things that you work hard to acquire, or like there was a record store in the suburbs of Seattle where I grew up called Roboto Records. And there was an older couple that worked there. And I would go in and just look through their, new editions, look through like, oh, here's the most recent 7 inches that had come in, the most recent LPs. And they sort of started to get a sense of what I was into. I was going back and finding, post-punk and punk from the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, especially out of scenes like Manchester, or Leeds, trying to get all those great post-punk bands out of the UK. And then, obviously it was like early Nirvana years, not early, but like, sort of peak Nirvana years. And I remember there was this Shocking Blue album, and they said, oh, it's the Shocking Blue. They're this Dutch band, and, Nirvana covered them on Bleach. They covered Love Buzz. You should really check them out. It's really cool, kind of like psych rock. And then I got that album. And if they hadn't told me about that, I would not have known. It was, I probably could see on the back of Bleach that it said the names of the writers of the song Love Buzz, but I wouldn't have been able to just type into a search engine Shocking Blue and find it, so I had to have this person literally tell me to get this album. And I still have that album. And I attach so much more meaning to that experience than I would, like just searching something on Spotify. And I think that's true for all of us in terms of those early experiences that really imprint upon us. You attach meaning to it because someone you cared about or someone you admired, introduced it to you, like the music your parents listened to, or your best friend in high school, or the first person that introduced you to some band that became your favorite band. Those are the things that we continue to love. And I enjoy finding new things, but I think I attach the most meaning to things that are associated with happiness and love, or the opposite, associated with some heartbreak, but just something that is so experiential that you can't deny it.
Yeah, for sure. What was it like being in Washington when Nirvana were like properly blowing up like that? Like, did you go to any of the early gigs? Like, did it feel kind of as seismic as like it's reported now historically?
It definitely did. I was in high school, so not quite able to go to everything that Nirvana was doing, but I saw them play with Sonic Youth that would have been 91. So I was in high school. They were opening for Sonic Youth. And at the time, I just thought, oh, this is just a really loud, rowdy kind of grunge band. It was pre-Nevermind. So the stuff was definitely coarser. It wasn't as catchy as what would come out on Nevermind. But I remember the first year at university. Well, first of all, I'll backtrack a second. When I was driving to school my senior year, Nevermind came out, and we had a radio station, sort of alternative rock radio station, 107.7 The End. And I was driving to school, and Smells Like Teen Spirit and the whole album, Nevermind, had come out. But the DJ, Marco Collins, he just said, this is the new Nirvana song. It smells like Teen Spirit. And he played it. And then he said, I'm just going to keep playing this song. And this is a mainstream radio station. This is a commercial radio station. And the whole drive to school, I just heard the song Smells Like Teen Spirit over and over again. That's how excited people were in Seattle. This was the suburbs of Seattle, but we knew the weather had changed. Everyone could sense it. Everyone just thought this is a line has been drawn and things will never be the same. And you could see it. You could see people who had formerly been considered sort of fringe, alternative weirdo people at your school. And then all of a sudden everyone else wanted to wear a flannel and, grow their hair out. And, the whole idea of things being kind of atomized and compartmentalized and was sort of broken down. Like suddenly being different was popular. And then it really changed, I think, for kids who had formerly felt like outsiders. There were sort of the goths and the metalheads and the punk kids. And then they literally me and my friends would sit in a separate area of like the school cafeteria. And then all of a sudden everyone was like, wait, you guys might have been on to something. Is there other music we should listen to? And we were like, yeah, there's a ton of music you should be listening to. So that was a huge, paradigm shift, just in terms of what was valued in culture, specifically music, but also it bled into aesthetics and art. And just this idea that there had been something brewing kind of underground or on the periphery that suddenly mainstream people thought, oh, wow, we potentially been missing out. And then, of course, there was a feeding frenzy for whatever other band, existed in Seattle or elsewhere who sounded a little bit like Nirvana. So that was a major change. And then what I was starting to get to is when I went to university, my first year, Mudhoney, which was another band that was big at the time, and Nirvana sort of surpassed them, but they were a precursor to Nirvana, a grunge band on Sub Pop. They were playing at my university, and everyone started to say, I think there's going to be a special opener. This is post Nevermind, and Nirvana opened for Mudhoney, and it was incredible. It was Nevermind was out. They played all those songs, but they were just, these were their friends, and that's one of the best concerts of my life. Just watching Nirvana, who were already on the ascent, probably about to be, or maybe already the biggest band in the world, just opening for their friends in a small town in Washington, and it was incredible.
That's so good. That is a perfect answer. And also, I bet, because obviously, it's obviously incredibly well documented how uncomfortable they were with the fame. But I reckon, playing those sort of shows where you can just almost kind of sneak in and have a good time, and the people that are there are going to be like actual proper fans, because I guess the flip side to everything you're saying about, suddenly all the kind of more mainstream kids are like, oh, what's this about? Is, maybe you kind of lose this like tribal thing slightly, where you feel like you have ownership of this stuff that's yours and suddenly everyone knows it. And did you ever see it that way? Or were you just kind of happy that this stuff was getting more ears?
I think there was both. I mean, there was definitely a snobbiness, I think, to any, insular community. Your identity is kind of built on being other, right? Being separate or different, and defining yourself in opposition to. So, there was always that sense of, there was that word poser that was thrown around a lot then. Oh, you're not a real fan. You're a poser. You're a late comer.
Name 3 songs.
You don't understand the context. And that now, of course, sounds so silly to sort of be so, gatekeeping or kind of closing the door behind you. I don't think is the best behavior, but I do think that people still do that. You hold this information, you build your identity around it. It's so sacred to you. It's helped you get through something. And then all of a sudden the floodgates are open and everyone's, enjoying it. And I think people would bristle at that a little bit. And then you sort of go deeper. You're like, well, Nirvana is now mainstream. I'm going to find the weirder band. So there's that version where you just sort of, you go the opposite direction. But I think, and it was easy at the time because the underground still very much existed. Once Nirvana became mainstream, there's such a conflation, right? There is sort of no underground because everything can be unearthed. No one wants to be unheard. No one wants to be unseen, right? It's such a more performance-based, exhibitionist kind of culture where, to be unknown, to not have a sort of presence is to feel sort of invisible, and fair enough, but there was, I think, a bit of pride in kind of not being mainstream. It was very anathema to certain ideologies to be mainstream. So people just doubled down, and sort of anybody that went mainstream, you just kind of let them go. And of course, to your point, Nirvana struggled with that. Nirvana struggled with their fans. I mean, it's been well documented how much Kurt Cobain was alienated by the people who were suddenly at his shows, who he thought, well, these people would have hated me. These people might hate me now if they actually knew me. So I think it had real life consequences on certain people who actually made it, had a certain level of fame, and then felt that kind of isolation and alienation. But I think for me, it kind of cemented my fondness for, seeking out the undiscovered. And I still have that, but I also enjoy things that are mainstream. So I feel like I operate pretty seamlessly between high-low and mainstream and sort of fringe stuff. I think we're in a good era of kind of having that all exist and accessible for sure.
The photo that you've brought in for us is some properly of its era photo booth snaps. I mean, how old were you at this point? Would you be sort of finding that whole kind of identity around this time?
I think I was very late teen. So it looks like I'm about 19. I think it was before Sleater-Kinney formed, but I was already in Olympia. Mm-hmm. And photo booths in some ways, it was kind of a version of a selfie, right? You were given essentially 3 or 4 opportunities to take a good photo of yourself, to have it, sort of reflect your personality. But there was also always something where and clearly in these photos, I'm really hamming it up, like trying on a version of myself, a heightened version of myself that really didn't exist. It just, I can see that I'm auditioning, sort of now I'm being goofy, now I'm being cool, now I'm being,
I like the tooth bed one. That's my favorite.
Yeah. Now I'm being tough. And I just think, those photo booths, it was like, it was not a professional photo session, but it sort of had that vibe. Like I'm really posing here, and it's just about me. Which in that way, it's sort of the precursor to the selfie, because it was. I mean, sure, you could also be in photo booths with your friends, and then I think you kind of did that collectively. But it really felt there was something very performative about the photo booth, and I can see in that photo early iterations of things that I hopefully would grow into, like that toughness and the teeth baring, or like the ability to take myself a little more seriously, but also maintain my innate goofiness, which I don't think I ever lost. I don't take myself that seriously, but at the time I definitely didn't take myself seriously, and probably could have stood to take myself a little more seriously. And I can kind of, that's what I love about those photo booth pictures. It sort of intimates this future self, or sort of exposes sides of you, especially in youthful versions of it, where you think, oh, I was going for something here that I wasn't quite able to embody yet. And then I can see my very cheap haircut, my greasy hair, my thrift store shirt that was probably very uncomfortable and highly flammable, some kind of synthetic polyester fabric. So it felt like a good distillation of who I was at that time. And anyway.
Yeah. I think taking yourself to, I mean, especially with photos and stuff, I've always thought that like the hardest thing about having your like photo taken for like press shots or, as a band would be the thing where you have to try it. Cause like, whenever someone points a camera at me, I instinctively do some sort of stupid like peace sign or I don't know, I forget where my hands go. But like if I had to try and look composed and cool and not smile and not do anything and try and like take yourself seriously, as you say, I can't do it. And like, was that something like, did you enjoy being able to do that sort of side of like being in a band and having like a professional photographer sort of saying this stuff, or like did it come naturally?
No, it didn't come naturally. I think everyone's except for probably the first people to ever do it, you're always imitating some idea of who you should be, what version of a rock star you are, even especially when you're not a rock star, you just think, okay, what would so-and-so have done? So yes, it's always, I remember one of our very first photo shoots was for this American magazine called Spin. It's pretty big rock music or music magazine at the time. And I'm pointing, just maybe doing kind of an Elvis Presley lip curl. There was certain, you had like 5 to 10 things that you could do that were in kind of the rock canon, the music canon, there weren't that many. You're still, and in some cases you're still everyone's still sort of referencing just a handful of poses that were kind of established and became canon, and then everyone's just doing a version of that.
And cameras, of course, weren't so ubiquitous then. So if there is a camera, it's like it's kind of a special thing.
Yes, and it feels imposing and certainly not commonplace. Now it's like someone always has a phone out, someone's always capturing every moment. But there was a formality to it, really. Like this is a professional setting. And when you're young, the only other version of like a professional photo shoot is like some terrible family photo shoot in a shopping mall, or your school photos, your yearbook photos. So I had never been quote unquote professionally photographed, except when me and my sister had been forced into some terrible vignette with a terrible backdrop, and that's so. In some
Did you
ways,
do a lot of those
in America? Yes, people, not every year, but I think you've probably seen them on. They're all over for a while. They're all over the internet. Like awkward family photos. Like this was just such a thing that people did, like probably before my time too, but 80s, 90s, like families would just go into these photo studios and you'd get your family photo and you'd put it on the wall for that year and you'd send it out to relatives and friends. And it was so awkward. People, dressed in the same color, they wear the same shirt. It's just horrible, but that was your only version of a professional photo. And I can see that in some of the early Sleater-Kinney photos, just really not knowing what to do. To be fair, I still feel like that. When we were doing press for Little Rope, Chris, our publicist, who's on this for the listener, our publicist is on this too. He witnessed. You're still kind of doing the same goofy thing, where you kind of have to buy into your own mythology. You have to sort of get out of your head and just allow yourself to be a version that, of course, you're not in the day to day. And there are some people who are better at it than others. And we know that those are the people who can really serve in a photo, can really just give face. And you're just like, dang, that is incredible. It is unapologetic. It's undeniable. They can turn that on in an instant. And I think I've definitely gotten better at it. You kind of have to, it's like learning on the job.
No
sure.
Elvis lip curls anymore. Retired
I don't.
the point and the curl.
I've retired the lip curl. I also have fallen prey to the peace sign, the Ringo Starr. I feel like Ringo Starr was really the first person that just decided that every photo he would do a peace sign. Now it's very common.
Yeah, I've never. If only he knew that that would be part of his legacy. That
I'm sure he does know. I think he does know now. But it's funny because I never flash a peace sign. I'm not walking along the street flashing peace signs at people. None of us are, but in a photo, like it's also such a benign kind of thing. It doesn't really mean, the meaning has been drained from it. It's not like those 1960s anti-war. You're really just, it's like, what can I do with my hands? I guess I'll do this. It's, it's inoffensive. You're not flipping someone off. You're not, doing the hang loose, which would be sort of more esoteric. And unless you're a surfer, I'm not sure why you would. So the peace sign is like it's sort of the middle ground there.
Yeah. A safe halfway house that sort of,
yeah. Who's going to fight? Who's going to argue with you? Who's going to argue with you?
Exactly.
No one's going to say like, fuck peace. No, you're just like, okay, yes, I'm pro peace too.
Did you have people that like you would sort of study their kind of stagecraft or their photos or that sort of thing when you were kind of like really young and learning how to be a musician on stage?
Yeah. So, growing up in the 80s, I was immersed in just mainstream pop and early versions of MTV, but I was such a huge fan of, Madonna, Michael Jackson, and Prince, and all just, just huge artists. And that I didn't quite really, I loved their music, but they were so larger than life. And I couldn't quite, there was no way to sort of demystify what they were doing because it was so huge. There was really no way to understand like how the music was kind of being made at the time. So it wasn't until I actually started going to shows and could push to the front and actually see the way someone had their guitar settings and how their amp was set up, what kind of amp they had, if they had any guitar effects pedals, and really just sort of deconstruct the whole thing. And those were the artists that I started really observing and learning from. So yeah, certainly someone like Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore, both of them, I just thought they were so cool and iconic on stage. Kathleen Hanna, of course, is just such a undeniable and unapologetic presence on stage. And Toby Vale as well. She would go from the drums. She had this kind of an insouciant quality, but also very tough. She's sort of, her face looked like she didn't care, but her body cared. That's just such an interesting juxtaposition. And then she would go to the front of the stage and suddenly be this singer who just, she had a very different kind of presence than Kathleen. So I really studied them. And then also, I loved The Who in that, they had already put out their best records, but I was really into The Who at the time. And I loved the way Pete Townsend played. I loved the way he jumped on stage. I loved that there was something that felt very decadent and kinetic about his stage moves, with the windmill and the kick jump and things that I, definitely copied. So yeah, there were a handful of artists. I didn't get to see The Who, but by then I had, I would look at pictures of him, or you would watch some old footage and just be like, oh yeah, this guy's incredible. But yeah, a lot of it was just bands I would go see, even like Calvin Johnson, Singer Beat Happening. He just had this really weirdo, sexy vibe on stage. Just, you're like, this shouldn't be that attractive, but somehow he sort of made, it was people, Kim Gordon has this quote that I'm paraphrasing about, people go to see someone believing in themselves, that's why you go to a concert. And I think what I was buying into was all these different variations of people believing in themselves, and people who probably wouldn't have been given that by society. People who would have been not considered conventionally attractive or conventionally a good singer. Punk and indie was all sort of about DIY and bringing to the table what you had. And some of it was avant-garde and certainly it was unconventional. But people performed it as if it was the thing, as if it was the norm, as if it was what people wanted. And eventually people wanted it, and I loved that version of music and that version of performance. I definitely copied it.
Yeah, I love that. I think also that thing, whether you're a performer or whether you're just a listener, I definitely remember kind of the point when something kind of clicked and it felt like such a relief that you kind of found something that made sense to you and that made you feel kind of at home in it in its own strange way. I think there was a real, especially, if you grow up and you maybe don't naturally fit in with the crowds at your school or, in wherever, there's a real sort of oh, thank God, there is a place that feels natural. How did you, when you were properly, going back before sort of bands and teenagers and stuff, when you were a kid, did you have other things that gave you that sort of feeling, or did it take finding kind of music and stuff to do that?
To be honest, I think it really did take finding music, because it allowed me a means of expression and of understanding the world and of translating complex emotions that I was unable to express up until that point. It gave me a conduit for that. It gave me, it gave meaning to my life and gave shape to my life, I think, in a way that other things had not. I definitely was obsessed with movies as a kid, and I think that was my escape. Before that, a way of understanding the world, I really got into like golden age of Hollywood films, like older movies, and just would,
which I'm sure made you very popular with your
so popular. I would host they had this board game that was kind of like a parlor game called How to Host a Murder, and you would assign roles. There would be eight roles, and you basically, everyone had like cards. You would sort of read through them, and you would solve this murder mystery. One of you was the murderer. And I did not do that halfway. That was a full commitment. There was one called Power and Greed. It's funny how I can remember this stuff and probably couldn't remember an article in economics that I read like 2 days ago. But anyway, so Power and Greed was actually based on old Hollywood. So it was a real confluence of my interests here. And I decorated the whole house, or sorry, just our living room, but I replaced our family photos. I cut out pictures of actresses and actors from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and signed them to the main character, who was this movie mogul. And so it was like we were in his Hollywood, living room. And then all dressed up. So we all dressed up in, 1940s garb, and it was incredible. And we just had this, I made my parents had some silver that they had inherited, some platters and serving trays and whatnot. And I literally just made food in the microwave, but then put it on these silver platters and just had this. And that was like middle school or junior high. I don't know what equivalent is in England, but anyway, where you're like 13, 14. And yeah, that was pretty nerdy. So
you believed in it.
I love it. I love the commitment to the bit.
Yeah. Full commitment. So music, fortunately, was a way of kind of channeling some of that nerdiness, some of that performer mentality, some of that stepping into, someone else's shoes and trying on identity and, playing with gender and just all of that stuff. It allowed me to do that, but with something that had a bit more teeth, a bit more bite to it, and the music I was listening to was, it was irascible. It was, it was gritty, and that helped, because then I was, dealing with sort of angstiness, very common to that age. So it really was the first thing that kind of dug me out of whatever kind of no man's land I was in, and helped me find some clarity.
Yeah, if you hadn't have found music, then you probably would have ended up just doing like medieval reenactments or something like that. I'd be at Ren fairs. Yeah, watch out, world.
The objects that you brought in is an Epiphone guitar. Is this Epiphone the first guitar you had? Yeah.
So as many kids, I had a lot of interests, a lot of fleeting interests and hobbies. I did, sport. I did, I don't know. I mean, built forts, hung out with friends, a lot of things that I thought I was getting into, and then would just decide I didn't want to anymore. And when I was my first year of high school, so 10th grade, this was about 15, that's when someone introduced me to punk music, essentially. Before that, I was just, still listening to whatever was on the radio, whatever was on MTV. And there was a teacher, my chemistry teacher, brought in the Jam, all mod cons. and he said, I think you'd like this. I had just started kind of like dressing a little differently. And I think he saw my, cut off jean shorts and, over a pair of leggings that was sort of very grunge at the time. And I was trying to dress a little cooler in my mind. Anyway, he sort of saw my slow transformation and thought, you need to listen to this album. And that unlocked so many things for me, particularly music just that was coming out of, a different country and obviously had its own history and such a, vast scene over there. And so I listened to all Mod Cons, and then I really wanted to play guitar, because then I was like, oh, there was the Jam and there's the Buzzcocks and then, go back to America, there's the Ramones. You just, it was like so much information. But for the first time, it was music that I thought, oh, I could probably do this. It's not Quincy Jones producing Michael Jackson. Like, I'm not going to be able to do that at the age of 15. I don't own that kind of equipment. I can't write a song like Prince, but I could probably write a song like Paul Weller, this 3-chord song by the Jam, or 3-chord song by the Ramones. So I thought and also the music just spoke to me emotionally, and it was people singing about their own lives. It was singing about their friends, singing about their cities. And so I went with my dad to a little music store, and I didn't know anything about guitars. And one of the employees there, showed an Epiphone was obviously much cheaper than an actual Gibson, which is usually what Epiphone is sort of a copy of, whether it's an SG or a Strat, they sort of do their version of that. And so I bought, this cherry red and white Epiphone, and it was basically in the shape of a Stratocaster, which is actually a Fender copy. And cherry red and white, little solid state amplifier, which is sort of not a tube amp for anyone that's, anyway, that's my explanation of it. Basically a cheaper amplifier with different kind of electronics than a tube amp. So it's not as warm, but it was in my price range, and took that guitar home. And that really changed my relationship to music and creativity, and gave me a form of expression, gave me a voice when I just felt so incoherent at the time, so unable to say what I meant or to really access my feelings through words or through conversation. I was shy and insecure and kind of uncomfortable going through the world at the time. But music gave me, and that guitar gave me, an opportunity to start to find a way to see myself, to figure out who I was, and to also connect with friends and other sort of fellow travelers that were in the same boat as myself, and formed a high school band. And there were other people playing music in my high school. And so, that guitar really changed, it was like being given this tool that unlocked so many things for myself. And even if I hadn't continued doing music, I think it would have just instilled in me this sense of confidence, this sense of possibility that nothing up until that point had.
That's really good. I mean, what a ledge, your chemistry teacher. I think like seeing a kid and being like, I know what this kid needs. Like, I think that's such an amazing thing. And like, because it does just take like one person to sort of like spot something in you and kind of give you the tools that you might not have to do it. Like, have you ever had any sort of like, lovely moment to be able to go back and tell these people like how much they changed? I mean, even with Weller, like, have you ever played with him and told him that he was like your gateway into everything? I've never met Paul Weller, and I have never seen that chemistry teacher again. To clarify, it was a student teacher. I don't know if you guys have those in the UK, but when people are training to become teachers, sometimes they'll come into a classroom for a certain amount of weeks. So I could probably find that chemistry teacher, but I don't know who the student teacher was, because he was just there for, 6 weeks learning how to be a teacher. And then he probably went on to, teach at some other school. So I don't have his name, but that couple I was talking about at Rubato Records,
in the Seattle suburbs who gave me the Shocking Blue record, and also a handful of other great records that I still have in my collection. When we were doing the signing, record store signing, when Little Rope came out, she came to the signing and she said, "Hey, because I've mentioned her a couple times. I always give her credit, and she came up and said hi, and it really, I almost cried. It's just like,
that's
such an emotional thing. Just like this, like, I think people don't realize that they're changing your life. Of course, they're just doing what they know. He probably no longer listened to the Jam. He might have, it was the 90s. He probably had shifted to CDs. He probably was getting rid of all of his LPs, thinking these will never come back. And, he handed me that album, and, I still have that version of All Mod Cons. I've obviously awesome. in my record shopping, I've seen that album come up. Now there's obviously reissues of it, but I still have that copy that he gave me, and I wore that record out. So yeah, I think it's a really beautiful thing. And I always try to remember that when I'm interacting, whether it's a fan or just someone who is a little younger than me, or someone who is just seeking, like, I don't want to shut that down in someone, that ability to just be porous and curious. You don't want to squelch that in anyone. You don't also, I think there's a way of not prescribing something either. These were people who were just suggesting. They weren't saying this is the right thing to listen to, or this is the only thing to listen to, or this is better than something else. They just said, check this out. I think you'll like it. And it allowed me to find my place in it, to have that music meet me where I was at. It wasn't like, oh, you shouldn't be listening to this crappy pop music. Check out this. It was just like, here you go. And it really is such a gift to have your world open up.
Well, I guess it would be nice if I could touch your body. I know not everybody has got.
But what wasn't crappy pop music is the song that you've chosen, which maybe was before this time, but an absolutely glorious song, obviously. George Michael's Faith. So that came out when you would have been, like a sort of 12, 13, something like that?
I think so. I don't know, what is it, 89, 87? Anyway, yes.
Yeah.
Early teen, preteen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for me, I was obviously listening very, immersed and dedicated in all that pop music. But there was something about George Michael as he moved away from Wham and Faith came out. And now, of course, I realize that there was so much that was queer coded about George Michael, but it just wasn't out in the open yet. And there was just this honesty to his music, this vulnerability that I hadn't quite heard in, at least, I mean, obviously it existed in Prince for sure, less so in Madonna, less so in Michael Jackson, less so in some of the other huge pop stars at the time. But George Michael, there was just something so aching and a little lonely in his singing, and that it was kind of the first pop music that gave me that kind of like feeling in your chest, like a little bit like when you are heartbroken, that just kind of bittersweet, that heartache. And I loved that song. I loved in the video, he's kind of doing a throwback. He's kind of, there's the jukebox and the shot of his ass, and he's dancing in these, it's just like there was something that for sure was harkening back to like the 50s. He was also drawing on and playing with like classic imagery and iconography, except as a gay man, except we didn't know he was a gay man. So it just had these layers that I think I could feel intuitively or sense, but didn't know why. I was sort of moved by it. And I was able to see, it was one of my second concerts. I went to the George Michael Faith tour, and I remember watching him on stage. It was an incredible performance. He had so many hits. He was an amazing performer. He would just run from one side of the stage to the other. He just really wanted to connect with the whole audience. And it for a pop concert, and pop concerts were just not as crazy as they are now. I mean, the production value was good for the time, but it was not as theatrical. So it really was just him on stage with a band and a cool light show. But I remember I was with my friends, and I think my friend's mom, and my friend turned to me and she said, I really want to F George Michael or something like that. She said, it was more explicit than that. I mean, more specific. Sorry. It wasn't more explicit than saying you want to have sex with George Michael, but it was a specific act that she wanted to perform on him. And I was like, whoa, first of all, I'm too young to hear this. But second, to be fair, she was a couple years older than me, whatever, but again, most people would see George Michael and think like, I want that man. And I was thinking, oh, that's so weird. I want to be that man. And so that was so mind blowing to me to just have this realization that what I wanted was to be doing what he was doing. I wanted to connect with people. I wanted to share my vulnerability and have it transcend the everyday, have it transcend language and words, and just be in front of people. It didn't have to be that many people. And to be fair, it has never been that many people, but to just have an understanding and a comprehension with a group of people where you see each other, you sense each other, and that makes you feel less lonely. And I just thought, I never need to make out with this guy. I just want to be that guy. And so I think I picked that song because that was what unlocked my love of George Michael, which then brought me to that show, which then helped me understand what I wanted to do and who I wanted to be.
Was that the sort of awakening of that in you? Like, had you ever sort of considered like being on stage or performing or kind of sharing in that way?
I always, going back to the How to Host a Murderer, and I was always the theatrical
Sorry,
performative.
obviously there were.
Yes, there were early hints, but I was a performative kid, but I had never sort of seen, because I had seen Madonna. That was my first concert when I was in fifth grade. But I mean, she was so singular. There was there was artifice involved in it, which there still isn't. I'm not saying that in a negative way, but there was a version that Madonna, what she was conveying was not necessarily like heart and soul. It was swagger and it was power and it was subversion, but I didn't imagine that's not who I was, and I think so. George Michael was the first thing that I thought, oh, here's a performer that there's this sensitivity that is undeniable, that is unwavering, that is just, you can sense it, and then it was that plus the Paul Weller, the Jam album. I sort of, I guess, in talking to you guys, sort of stringing together the things that help me, get out of my suburban upbringing and get out of my sort of, diffident nature where I didn't know who I was. But so George Michael, I think, was the first thing. And then it took actually just discovering music that I could relate to. I mean, even though I could relate to George Michael and Faith, I knew I wasn't going to make pop music, and so then you add punk music to that, and then there it is, and you get a guitar, and then you're on your way. So those are sort of the tent poles, I guess.
Yeah, I guess also, I mean, what you're saying about like, even though he wasn't openly gay at that time, like, do you think that like sort of seeing someone where you felt that sort of like queer energy almost like had a sort of added layer of kind of bringing that or kind of resonating with you in some way?
I think the idea that you could have multiple selves in art and on stage, that there was mystery and secrecy that wasn't necessarily bad, that there was something that you were protecting in yourself, that you weren't giving the audience everything. And I like that. I like that in watching a great acting performance. I like that mystery in music, that there's something that you want to peel back and unravel in the person. And they're sort of like teasing it out to you, but not giving you something that's super explicit or over the top. They're allowing, because it allows you in, right? It's an invitation. It's saying, come closer and we'll figure this out together. It's not just sort of putting it on you. It's not an imposition. It's an invitation. And I think I'm drawn to that a lot. And, obviously it's better for people to now. I mean, of course, George Michael would have wanted to be out before he was out. Mm-hmm. But I think I also appreciate the ways that people vacillate between being hidden and being seen, whether that's with queerness or something else. I mean, the private and public self, I like where that intertwines. And I think I was drawn to that for sure. And also, I mean, I think that's why it was sometimes tinged with sadness, what he was doing. There was always something a little melancholy, even, less so in Faith. I mean, there's other songs that have even more of that yearning, but I love
Careless Whisper. Come on. Like, that's like the saddest song in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's heartbreaking.
Have you seen that Wham documentary?
Loved it. I loved that friendship. I thought it was such a unique story. I mean, what a gift, those two men like gave to us. And for Andrew Ridgeley, I mean, it was one of the, I was like, this is one of the classiest like people, there's this so rare to like have someone who really understood like their role. First of all, trusted that he had, made an indelible imprint upon George, that George took and learned and gleaned from Andrew, helping him become who he was, but that at the same time, Andrew understood his limitations. Like that is, I mean, yeah, I just think that that's such a rarity, and to not have it be, tinged with like bitterness or resentment is kind of amazing.
He's like the most like egoless man, just in a, lovely.
Yeah. Very, very beautiful story. I loved that documentary.
And I guess also, I mean, obviously it's very different with you and Corin because there's no sort of, it's way more equal, and there's not sort of one, the big star and then the supporting role. But I mean, like, I guess you probably can't help but watch something like that where it's people that have grown up together and that are doing this sort of mad journey, and kind of be quite appreciative of like, the bandmate that you have standing next to you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're really in awe of the fact that, I mean, for each of us, it's our longest relationship. It's outlived and outlasted, and so many other friendships or romantic relationships. It's just such a constant. And, I feel very fortunate. I think it's more unusual than I realized. But of course we didn't know going into it that we would still be collaborating or even be friends, this many years later. But I feel very lucky.
Good. And speaking of didn't know, we always sort of round off these chats now with like, which I've just realised, shamelessly stolen from Drag Race when they show them photos of their younger selves and say, what would he think of you now? But if you were looking at the Carrie that is in those photo booth photos, who has no idea what the world, what the crazy life that she's going to lead, like, what do you think that she would be most proud or excited of what has come to pass in the years since?
Honestly, I think maintaining some of that silliness, that still exists, that I truly feel like I don't take myself that seriously, that I'm able to possess the things that I see in that photo. Yes, there is a little bit of that like confidence and swagger, but for the most part, that's tempered with, I think humility and just humor. And so I'm glad. I think the younger Carrie would be pleasantly surprised that while I have adjusted and grown and matured, and hopefully I'm a better communicator and, better at a lot of things, that I have kept what I think is just an optimism, essentially. You know, I try to, because I think optimism is a form of curiosity. It doesn't have to be, you know, ignorance. And anyone that's looking out in the world has, you know, skepticism and cynicism. But I think to maintain a little bit of that optimism is just saying that you're willing to be teachable, that you're willing to just sit in the world and learn something. And I see that in the younger photo. And I think hopefully that version of me would be, surprised and happy to know that some of that still exists.
That was Carrie Brownstein on the last episode of season 2 of Before They Knew Better with DIY Magazine. If you liked that interview, or if you liked any of our other episodes, why not give us a like, a nice review? You can subscribe to the podcast so that when we return in September for season 3, you'll be bang up to date and get us straight into your inbox. If you haven't gone back and listened to our previous episodes, why not do it now? You've got, 3 months to sort of get up to speed. We have had people including Lauren Maybury of Churches. We have had last week we had Graham Coxon. We've had Bill Ryder Jones, CMAT, Bill Ryder Jones, Metronomy, everything, the Cribs, and that is just on series 2. Dig back into season 1 and you've got even more. So there are 23 more episodes of Before They Knew Better that you can catch up on. You can also catch up on Sleater-Kinney's most recent album Little Rope, which is out now, and you can get a read on. Why don't you get a little read on of the newest issue of DIY Magazine? It is our June issue and it is fronted by Glass Animals. We are doing a bumper July-August double issue, which will land a little bit later than normal, midway through July. But if you keep your peepers peeled for that, it is fronted by, I'm going to say, the most exciting British and Irish band at the moment. So that is out in middle of July. We are back in September, date TBC, and we will see you then. But until then, thank you to all of our wonderful guests that have taken part in this recent series of Before They Knew Better. We've had some great chats and we are grateful to you all. Thank you to Giles. Hi Giles. Thanks Giles.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening, and we'll see you in September for more of this silly old bollocks. Bye.